On the night of November 7, 1941, 392 Wellington and Hampton bombers lifted off from airfields across eastern England. Their crews were briefed to demolish the Krupp armament works in Essen, the beating heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. Each navigator had studied reconnaissance photographs of the sprawling factory complex. Each bomb aimer had memorized the approach vectors. But when they arrived over the Ruhr Valley, everything went sideways. Smoke from industrial chimneys merged with winter fog into an impenetrable soup. Searchlights stabbed upward through the gloom, blinding pilots. Anti-aircraft fire forced evasive maneuvers that threw off all calculations. Of those 392 bombers, only 109 crews claimed they had even found Essen, let alone hit it. German damage reports the next morning told the real story. 14 houses damaged, 2 small fires extinguished, and the Krupp works untouched. This was not an isolated disaster. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Bomber Command dispatched thousands of sorties against precise industrial targets: ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil plants, submarine pens. The crews returned swearing they had plastered their objectives. Then, reconnaissance flights would photograph the targets days later, and the film revealed pristine factory roofs without so much as a scorched patch. Something was catastrophically wrong, but nobody wanted to admit it. The official line held that British bombers were steadily dismantling Germany's war economy, one precision raid at a time. That comfortable lie shattered in August 1941 when a civil servant named David Bunsenbutt analyzed 633 raid photographs from June and July. His statistical methodology was brutally simple. If a bomber's camera captured a photo within 5 miles of the target at the moment of bomb release, that sortie counted as accurate. The results horrified the War Cabinet. Only 1 aircraft in 3 got within 5 miles. Over the Ruhr Valley, where haze and industrial smoke created a permanent twilight, the ratio collapsed to 1 in 10. 2/3 of Bomber Command's bombs were falling on empty German countryside, achieving nothing except dead air crews and wasted resources. The Bunsen report, as it became known, landed on Winston Churchill's desk like a grenade. The problem wasn't incompetence or cowardice. Navigation in 1941 relied on dead reckoning, calculating position by airspeed, compass heading, and estimated wind drift. A navigator might be 15 miles off course without knowing it. Bomb aimers peered through crude McNee bomb sights, trying to align crosshairs on targets they could barely see through darkness, weather, and defensive smoke screens. Germany's night fighter force was growing deadlier by the month, forcing bombers higher where accuracy became fantasy. The fundamental equation was inescapable. Pinpoint bombing, at night, over defended territory with existing technology was impossible. Either Bomber Command had to admit failure and stand down, or it had to find a completely different way to hurt Germany. By 1941, Britain's strategic bombing campaign against Germany was built on a dangerous illusion. On the night of November 7, 1941, a massive force of 392 Wellington and Hampton bombers took to the skies, tasked with a single vital objective: demolish the Krupp armament works in Essen, the very heart of the Nazi war machine. On paper, it was a mission of surgical precision. Navigators had memorized reconnaissance photos, and bomb aimers had plotted their vectors. But in the air over Germany, the plan collapsed. The crews arrived over the Ruhr Valley to find themselves blinded by an impenetrable soup of industrial smoke and thick winter fog. Searchlights sliced through the gloom, and heavy anti-aircraft fire shattered their formations. Of the entire 392 bomber force, only 109 crews even claimed to have found the city, let alone the factory. The next morning, German damage reports confirmed the humiliating truth: a few houses damaged, 2 small fires extinguished, and the Krupp works untouched. This was not an isolated disaster. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Bomber Command dispatched thousands of sorties against precise industrial targets: ball-bearing factories, synthetic oil plants, submarine pens. The crews returned swearing they had plastered their objectives. Then, reconnaissance flights would photograph the targets days later, and the film revealed pristine factory roofs without so much as a scorched patch. Something was catastrophically wrong, but nobody wanted to admit it. The official line held that British bombers were steadily dismantling Germany's war economy, one precision raid at a time. That comfortable lie shattered in August 1941, when a civil servant named David Bunsen analyzed 633 raid photographs from June and July. His statistical methodology was brutally simple. If a bomber's camera captured a photo within 5 miles of the target at the moment of bomb release, that sortie counted as accurate. The results horrified the War Cabinet. Only one aircraft in 3 was getting even this close. Over the Ruhr Valley, where haze and industrial smoke created a permanent twilight, the ratio collapsed to 1 in 10. 2/3 of Bomber Command's bombs were falling on empty German countryside, achieving nothing except dead air crews and wasted resources. The Bunsen report, as it became known, landed on Winston Churchill's desk like a grenade. The problem wasn't incompetence or cowardice. Navigation in 1941 relied on dead reckoning, calculating position by airspeed, compass heading, and estimated wind drift. A navigator might be 15 miles off course without knowing it. Bomb aimers peered through crude McNee bomb sights, trying to align crosshairs on targets they could barely see through darkness, weather, and defensive smoke screens. Germany's night fighter force was growing deadlier by the month, forcing bombers higher where accuracy became fantasy. The fundamental equation was inescapable. Pinpoint bombing, at night, over defended territory with existing technology was impossible. Either Bomber Command had to admit failure and stand down, or it had to find a completely different way to hurt Germany. The problem demanded a different kind of solution, and it got a different kind of leader. When Arthur Harris assumed command of Bomber Command on February 22, 1942, he was not a man for subtle tactics. 50 years old, blunt, abrasive, and utterly uninterested in nuance, his subordinates called him Butch behind his back, a nickname that captured both his initials and his brutal approach to warfare. He had read the Bunsen report and drawn a conclusion that made his colleagues queasy, but which to him was simple, unassailable logic. If his bombers couldn't hit factories, they shouldn't stop trying. Instead, they should hit entire cities. This was not to be collateral damage, it was to be the primary objective. His new doctrine was to destroy the very fabric of urban life, demolish the houses where the factory workers slept, shatter the utilities that supplied their water and power, and burn the shops where they bought their food. The goal was no longer to break a single factory, but to break the civilian morale of the entire nation, collapsing its capacity to wage war from the inside out. The Air Staff had already been cautiously circling this idea. A directive from February 14th, just days before Harris took command, had authorized the tax on industrial cities, even mentioning morale as a target. But it was wrapped in polite euphemisms about focusing on industrial areas. Harris, in his first memo on February 25th, stripped away all pretense. He stated that his force would now practice area bombing, systematically saturating entire urban districts with a devastating mix of high explosives and incendiaries, until nothing was left standing. The logic was as simple as it was terrible. The working-class housing packed tightly around factories couldn't dodge a bomb the way a single building could. A city 3 miles across presented a target that even the most off-course navigator could find. Precision was dead. Brute force was the new doctrine. The first true test came on March 28, 1942. The target was Lübeck, a medieval port city on the Baltic. It was chosen not for its industry, it had little, but for its vulnerability. Its old, timber-framed core was perfect kindling. Harris dispatched 234 bombers with a new, terrifying payload. 2/3 incendiaries to ignite the city, and 1/3 high explosives to shatter water mains and prevent firefighters from stopping the blaze. Pathfinders lit up the historic core with flares, and the main force simply dumped 400 tons of ordnance into the inferno. The result was a firestorm visible 200 miles away. Half the city's built-up area vanished.
62% of its homes were gone. Industrial damage was minimal, but Harris had proven his concept. He repeated the formula against Rostock in April, then planned something monumental. On May 30th, 1942, Harris launched Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid, targeting Cologne. He scraped together every airworthy plane in his command, including obsolete types and training units. In just 90 minutes, 1,047 bombers dropped 1,500 tons of bombs on the city. The sheer concentration overwhelmed all German defenses. Cologne's fire brigades recorded 2,500 separate fires, which quickly merged into massive firestorms that consumed 600 acres of the city center. Some 45,000 people were made homeless. When the smoke cleared, reconnaissance showed that industrial production in Cologne had dropped by half for months. This was not because the factories themselves were destroyed. Many escaped serious damage, but because the city that supported them no longer functioned. The workers had no homes, no water, no power, and no will to work. Area bombing was no longer a theory. It was Bomber Command's brutal, unwavering doctrine. The moral implications of area bombing troubled some, but Harris dismissed them with characteristic bluntness. Germany had bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. Total war meant total destruction. The Luftwaffe had taught the lesson. The RAF was simply applying it with industrial efficiency. The moral calculations of area bombing, however, were soon overshadowed by a new and terrifying discovery. For months, British intelligence had been piecing together fragments of disturbing information, intercepted signals mentioning Vergeltungswaffen, or vengeance weapons, and scattered interrogations of prisoners who spoke of bizarre rocket experiments on Germany's northern coast. Most of it was dismissed as rumor. Then, in late March 1943, a package smuggled out of occupied Poland by resistance operatives landed at MI6 headquarters. It contained photographs that made analysts' stomachs drop. Taken near a remote fishing village called Peenemünde on the Baltic island of Usedom, the images showed massive concrete structures, strange 40-foot-long cigar-shaped objects on rail cars, and construction on a scale that dwarfed any normal military project. The rumors were suddenly transformed into a concrete, terrifying certainty. Squadron leader Douglas Kendall of the RAF's Central Interpretation Unit began flying high-altitude Spitfire photo reconnaissance missions over the island. With each new set of images, the troubling picture grew clearer. The site was enormous, covering several square miles, and split into 3 distinct zones: vast production halls, a development complex with wind tunnels and labs, and housing estates for a huge workforce. But it was the sleek, finned rockets visible on launch platforms that transfixed the analysts. Dr. R.V. Jones, the brilliant young head of British scientific intelligence, was tasked with connecting the dots. Cross-referencing the photos with his other intelligence fragments, he constructed a terrifying picture. The Germans were developing 2 weapons. The first, the V-1, was a crude but effective pilotless flying bomb. The second, the V-2, was something unprecedented in the history of warfare: a genuine liquid-fueled ballistic rocket. It was designed to climb 50 miles into the stratosphere before plunging onto its target at supersonic speeds, making it utterly impossible to intercept. On June 29, 1943, Churchill convened a special meeting. Jones presented his chilling evidence. German engineers, led by a man named Werner Braun, were solving immense technical challenges to create a weapon that could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles. If the program succeeded, Germany could bombard London from untouchable launch sites deep in occupied Europe. The slow, grinding war of attrition might be reversed overnight. The debate was intense. Some, like Churchill's advisor, Lord Cherwin, were skeptical. But Jones and Air Chief Marshal Portal made the decisive argument. Peenemünde was the source. It was the brain, the factory, and the university for the entire rocket program. Every scientist, every engineer, and every test article was concentrated in this one single location. If they could destroy Peenemünde before the weapons became operational, the entire program might collapse. The window was closing fast. Reconnaissance from June 23rd showed the development work was nearly complete. Within months, production would surely be dispersed to hardened, underground facilities where it would be impossible to attack. Churchill's decision was immediate and absolute. Bomber Command would obliterate Peenemünde. When Air Marshal Harris received the directive on July 7, 1943, he immediately recognized the immense problem. The mission, codenamed Hydra, violated every single principle of area bombing that had defined his command. Peenemünde wasn't a sprawling city. It was a small, precise, and distant target. It sat 600 miles from English bases, near the absolute limit of a heavy bomber's range, meaning less fuel for evasive maneuvers and lighter bomb loads. Worse, the objective demanded a level of precision that Harris himself had declared impossible. Intelligence had identified 3 tiny, specific zones that had to be destroyed: the experimental station, the production works, and the housing estate where the irreplaceable scientists lived. Missing by just half a mile would mean wasting the entire effort, sacrificing crews for nothing, and, most critically, alerting the Germans to relocate the entire program before a second attempt could be made. The man chosen to solve this impossible puzzle was Group Captain John Serby, a 40-year-old veteran from the elite Pathfinder force. He was assigned as Master Bomber, a new role that would make him the on-scene commander, orbiting the target to direct the bomber stream in real time. For weeks, Serby studied reconnaissance photos until he could navigate Peenemünde in his sleep. He identified the single critical vulnerability in every major night raid: creepback.
He knew that bomber crews, flying through the hell of heavy flak and stalked by night fighters, experienced overwhelming psychological pressure. Their instinct was to drop their bombs just a few seconds early and escape the inferno. This wasn't cowardice, it was human nature. But those few seconds, multiplied across hundreds of aircraft, meant the bomb impacts would walk steadily backward from the aiming point. The first wave might be accurate, but subsequent waves would see the fires from the earlier impacts, assume that was the target, and bomb short. The destruction would creep further and further away from the objective, wasting thousands of tons of bombs on empty territory. Serby's solution was brilliant and counterintuitive. He wouldn't just fight creepback, he would manage it. The operational plan was meticulous. The raid would be split into 3 waves, hitting the 3 different zones over 40 compressed minutes. The first wave would hit the experimental works, marked in red. The second would hit the production halls, marked in green. The third would hit the scientists' housing, marked in yellow. But Serby's true innovation was his radio plan. He would monitor the bombing pattern from his Lancaster orbiting above. When he saw the inevitable creep back again, he would give a shocking order to the following waves: ignore the massive fires they could see, and instead aim for the dark, untouched areas beyond those fires, closer to the fresh markers the Pathfinders would be dropping. He was asking his crews to aim at what looked like the wrong target, trusting his voice on the radio over their own instincts. The tactical planning went even further. To maximize surprise, the raid would launch on the next full moon period, the night of August 17th, when moonlight would help navigation over the long, featureless water approach. 597 heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings, were allocated, carrying a deadly mix of high explosives to shatter buildings and incendiaries to ignite the wreckage. The Pathfinders would mark the targets from a terrifyingly low altitude of 6,000 feet, not their usual 20,000, accepting immense risk to ensure accuracy. The final element was a brilliant deception. Intelligence estimated 200 German night fighters were within range of Peenemünde. To draw them away, 8 fast Mosquito light bombers would simultaneously stage a mock raid on Berlin, 120 miles to the southwest. The Luftwaffe Night Fighter Command would face an agonizing choice: defend the capital or protect an obscure research station.
The planners gambled that the Germans would instinctively defend Berlin, giving Serby's main force a precious, blood-soaked window of time. At 2100 hours on August 17th, the bombers began lifting off, one every 30 seconds. They flew northeast over the North Sea in radio silence, a vast armada converging on the narrow approach corridor to Usedom Island. At 2320, the mosquitoes hit Berlin, dropping flares and window chaff to simulate a major raid. As planners had hoped, the German night fighter control lit up, vectoring its elite squadrons towards the capital. For 18 precious minutes, Germany's nocturnal defenders raced southwest, while 597 British bombers approached from the northwest. At 2345, John Serby's Lancaster crossed the Peenemünde coast. Below him, the experimental station gleamed pale in the moonlight. The first red target indicators burst into brilliant crimson stars over the experimental works. Serby keyed his radio. Master bomber to all aircraft. Target marked. First wave, attack red indicators immediately. The first Lancasters rolled in. The northern section of Peenemünde vanished under erupting fireballs as 4,000-pound blockbuster bombs detonated. But within minutes, Serby's worst fear was realized. Creepback began. Crews in the following aircraft, seeing the Earth erupt ahead, released their bombs fractionally early. The concussion shook their planes, flak shells began to find their range, and the primal urge to escape took over. Serby saw the pattern developing, the deadly southward drift. All aircraft, his calm voice cut through the chaos. You are undershooting, undershoot, ignore the fires, bomb on the red markers only. The second wave arrived at 0007, targeting the production works with green markers, but the creepback phenomenon intensified. Smoke from the first wave's impacts billowed south. Approaching crews saw the raging fires and assumed that was the target. Serby's frustration crackled over the radio. You're undershooting badly. Aim at the dark area north of the fires. North. Some crews corrected, others already on their bomb runs released on the visible flames. The line of high explosives marched steadily southward, walking inexorably away from the production halls and towards the third target, the housing settlement. Then, at 12:012, the Luftwaffe night fighters arrived. The first bomber, a Halifax, exploded without warning, vaporized by a Bf-110's upward-firing cannons. The sky filled with tracers as aircraft corkscrewed desperately. Through this maelstrom, Serby continued his directions, even as a night fighter passed within 200 yards of his own cockpit. The third wave pressed in with their yellow markers, designating a settlement area, but the settlement was already burning, a victim of the creepback from the previous waves. The distinction between intentional targeting and accidental undershoot had dissolved into simple, terrible devastation. Bomber Command paid a heavy price for this strategic victory. 40 aircraft were lost over Peenemünde, a 6.7% loss rate that stung deeply, but remained just below the catastrophic 10% threshold that deemed operations unsustainable. In the following days, debriefing sessions produced hundreds of crew reports, which were handed over not just to commanders, but to the operational research analysts, the mathematicians and scientists in uniform, whose job was to strip away the fog of combat and extract cold, hard, transferable lessons. Their conclusions would reshape the rest of the air war. The creepback phenomenon dominated their analysis. Plotting the bomb impacts against the raid's timeline revealed the pattern with mathematical certainty. Each minute of the attack, the center of the bomb pattern had drifted approximately 100 yards southward. Aircraft arriving at the end of the raid were on average hitting 1,500 yards short of those at the beginning. This wasn't incompetence, it was a predictable psychological human reaction to overwhelming stress. The analysts calculated that without Group Captain Serby's continuous radio corrections, his counterintuitive orders to aim long at the darkness, the whole raid would have missed the scientific facilities completely, wasting 1,800 tons of bombs on the beach and the Baltic Sea. This single finding crystallized into a new doctrine that sounded paradoxical. For maximum accuracy, Bombardiers must be forced to aim at points that appear wrong. Planners began mathematically calculating aiming point offsets. If analysis predicted a 700-yard creep pack, the pathfinders would deliberately drop their markers 700 yards beyond the actual target. The main force would aim for the markers, and their natural human tendency to undershoot would bring the bombs down directly onto the objective. This sophisticated technique became standard procedure, finally making a form of precision bombing possible. The master bomber concept was the second invaluable lesson. Before Peenemünde, raids followed rigid plans. Searby had proven that a single, experienced commander orbiting above the chaos and issuing real-time adjustments could salvage accuracy when a plan was failing. By November 1943, every major raid included a master bomber and a deputy who circled through flak and fighters for the entire attack, acting as airborne battle managers. This one innovation reduced average bombing errors by over 30%.
These lessons echoed long past 1945. When the United States Strategic Air Command, SAC, planned its nuclear strike protocols in the 1950s, the ghosts of Peenemünde were in the room. They assumed crews flying into a Soviet nuclear exchange would experience stress far exceeding anything in WW2. Their solution was automated offset aiming, with radar bomb sights pre-programmed to release weapons at calculated points beyond the visual target, mathematically compensating for the human urge to escape. Then there is the final, deeper irony that history could not have predicted. In May 1945, Wernher von Braun, the man whose V-2 program the RAF had tried so desperately to destroy, surrendered to American forces. He led a group of 127 of his top scientists who, under Operation Paperclip, became the core of the U.S. space program. The very man who survived the raid went on to design the Saturn V rocket that put Americans on the moon. The scientific expertise that British bombs failed to eliminate that night instead powered American aerospace supremacy for a generation. The victims at Trossenheide, however, remained forgotten for decades. Soviet authorities filed their deaths in statistical reports, but no memorials were built. They were a complicated footnote that muddied the clean narrative of a righteous war. Only in the 1990s, after German reunification, did researchers finally document the stories of the forced laborers who died. A small memorial now stands at the former campsite, acknowledging the deaths that were neither intended nor prevented. Strategic bombing always involved a brutal mathematics: tons of explosives versus industrial output, civilian casualties versus military advantage. The Peenemünde raid added another variable. It demonstrated that even when bombers aimed wrong on purpose, guided by the era's most sophisticated targeting doctrine, the chaos of war ensures that the bombs will find unintended victims. The raid achieved its strategic goal, but it remains a chilling lesson in the terrible, inescapable cost of collateral damage. The lessons of Peenemünde, the validation of the master bomber, the mathematical taming of creepback, imbued Bomber Command with a dangerous new confidence. Harris's force had successfully executed a precision raid at extreme range. Now he believed he had the tools to finish the job he had started in 1942. He had proven he could devastate smaller cities like Lübeck and Cologne. He had proven he could strike a small, specific target like Peenemünde. Now he would combine these abilities to destroy the ultimate target, the big city, Berlin itself. In November 1943, Arthur Harris launched what he believed would be his war-winning campaign. His logic, laid out in a famous memo to Churchill, was typically blunt. If he could destroy Berlin, the capital of the Reich, he could produce a state of devastation in which a disorderly exit from the city is likely to take place, and Germany's surrender would become inevitable by April 1, 1944.
He was, in effect, gambling his entire command on the theory that he could bomb a single, massive city into submission. The Battle of Berlin began on the night of November 18, 1943. It was the start of a brutal 5-month Black Winter. 16 separate mass raids were launched against the capital, supported by diversionary attacks on other German cities to keep the defenses guessing. Harris intended to pound the city into rubble night after night until the political will of the Reich simply snapped. But Harris and the crews he sent were about to discover that Berlin was not Lübeck, and the German night fighter force was not the same one that had been fooled by the Peenemünde diversion. The Luftwaffe's night fighter arm, the Nachtjagd, had become a lethally effective killing machine. Led by the brilliant General Josef Kammhuber and aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, they had adapted. They no longer relied on a rigid, static radar belt, the Kammhuber line, that pathfinders could easily identify and fly around. They had developed flexible tactics. Wilde Sau, wild boar fighters, were single-engine day fighters like the FW-190, flown by experienced pilots who would orbit directly over the target cities, hunting visually in the glare of searchlights, flares, and the fires of the burning city itself. Even more deadly was the Zama Sau tactic. Twin-engine night fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Ju-80, equipped with their own airborne radar, would be directed by a central ground controller into the main bomber stream long before it reached the target. Once inside the stream, a river of 700 bombers stretching for miles, the hunters were loose among the flock. Many of these fighters were now equipped with schräge Musik, slanted music, a dividingly simple weapon, 2 upward-firing 20mm cannons mounted in the fuselage. The German pilot would simply slide underneath a Lancaster or Halifax into its massive blind spot and aim for the fuel-laden wing root. The bomber's crew would feel a sudden, terrible rattling, and then their world would simply disintegrate. They never even saw the attacker. For the bomber crews, the 600-mile flight to Berlin and back became a journey into the heart of terror. It was long, cold, and achingly predictable. As they crossed the coast, German controllers would announce, "The British criminals are on their way," and the fighters would begin to vector. They flew in total darkness, a single, tiny aircraft in a vast sky, yet trapped in a densely packed stream. They were surrounded by invisible death. The psychological strain was unimaginable. They sat for hours in sub-zero temperatures, scanning the blackness for the telltale flicker of an engine exhaust, or worse, the sudden brilliant flash of a nearby bomber exploding. Flak over the target was a known danger, a curtain of steel they had to fly through, but the fighters were a personal, stalking dread. A rear gunner might catch a glimpse of a shadow, shouting a desperate "corkscrew port" to his pilot, initiating a violent, evasive dive that threw the 30-ton bomber around the sky. Sometimes it worked. Often it was too late. The stream was stalked all the way to Berlin, savaged over the target as Wilde Sau fighters pounced from above, and hunted all the way back to the North Sea. Harris kept pounding away. Night after night, the pathfinders marked the city, master bombers controlled the attack, and 4,000-pound cookies ripped the roofs off apartment blocks, allowing the 4-pound incendiaries to fall inside and burn the city from within. The devastation was immense. Hundreds of thousands were bombed out of their homes. Key industrial sites like the Alket Tank Factory were heavily damaged, but Berlin was not collapsing. It was simply too vast. It was a modern, wide boulevard metropolis, not a medieval tinderbox like Lübeck. Its essential services were decentralized, its defenses ferocious, and its population, under the iron grip of the Nazi regime, did not break. They endured. Meanwhile, the cost for Bomber Command was becoming catastrophic. In January 1944, they lost 315 bombers.
In February, 375. These weren't just machines. They were 2,600 highly trained and experienced air crew. Flight engineers, navigators, pilots, and gunners. The command was bleeding out its veteran corps. Harris, obsessed with his gamble, refused to stop. He believed he was just 1 or 2 more hard punches away from victory. He planned one more massive, decisive raid, not on Berlin, but on Nuremberg, another symbolic city. It would be the raid that broke the German spirit, or it would be the raid that broke Bomber Command.